but they have the most registered apps, over 200,000 apps available in the App Store. And that's not even counting the applications that are available for folks who have jailbroken their phone. The iPhone environment is primarily Objective-C 2.1 based, kind of, which we'll get into later. iOS 4.0 was released just this month, and they've been doing major software and hardware releases just about every year. So memory management in the iPhone. The iPhone is unique compared to the other platforms I've been talking about before because all of the applications are on managed code. You're responsible for allocating your memory, you're responsible for deallocating your memory, and unlike the Objective-C runtime on Mac OS X, you don't have any garbage collector to help you out with that. So all of the standard memory management and memory corruption issues that you're used to in unmanaged code on C and C++ are present on the iPhone, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. Just be aware that they're there, and you should make sure that you're taking care of those issues. An interesting thing to note for folks who aren't familiar with Objective-C is that you have the ability to release an object or auto-release an object. And auto-releasing is really just a nice way of saying, well, I'm not really sure if I need this object again, so let's put it in a pool, and I'll empty that pool when I'm really sure I don't need it anymore. So if you auto-release an object, it's still leaking until you drain that pool. So if you're using auto-release at all, make sure you're draining your pool in a timely manner. Otherwise, you might as well just be using release when you're absolutely sure. An interesting thing to note about preference storage for the iPhone is that as far as violating the sandbox concept, you have two options for saving preferences. You can do preferences all your own in your application, in your own sandbox, and do very complex settings. Or if your settings are of a more simplistic nature where you have a slider, a few fields, and that's it, you can implement a settings bundle that actually be installed as part of the settings application and run in that sandbox. Depending on the simplistic needs of your preferences, you could go either way, but one thing you might want to consider is given the attacking value of compromising a sandbox where every other application may be saving its preferences versus just your sandbox where you're saving your preferences. Each application is going to have different acceptable risk levels, but it's something to keep in mind that you have that choice. Mac OS X developers who are used to being able to share preferences between applications are used to be able to define suite-based preferences in a separate storage area where all of those applications can read and write from. Because of the sandbox nature of the iPhone, suite-based preferences just aren't supported. But as a suitable alternative, the keychain mechanism works quite well. If you have an application that reads and writes to the keychain based on entitlement, you can share that entitlement with other applications that you're signing with the same key, and the keychain will allow those applications to read and write to the same storage area because they all have the same entitlement. Just as a quick note, the entitlement concept isn't to be confused with the capabilities or permissions things. It's simply a keychain exclusive way to say, I'm an application, I'm able to read or write this value in the keychain. Also, the encrypted nature of the keychain takes off one layer of responsibility of making sure that information stays encrypted. So there are also some miscellaneous iPhone issues to talk about here. Being unmanaged code, the Xcode IDE that you'll be developing iPhone applications in, it can do some static analysis. It'll be able to tell you, in general cases where you're leaking memory or, unconventional coding practices. But it's not going to provide the level of static analysis that, say, folks who have been using Visual Studio are used to for calling out dangerous API calls or other security-related issues. And it's fairly unique, although it's not going to be for Windows. It's not going to be unique once Windows Phone 7 comes out, because they'll be using the same application approval process. Is that in the event of vulnerabilities found in an iPhone application, it can still take, on average, about 2 weeks for Apple to approve and start distributing a new version of the application. So coding defensively is even more important for iPhones, given that window of time that an attacker has to compromise even more targets. And because it's been in the news recently, I'd just draw attention to the fact that newer versions of the iPhone provide a layer of hardware encryption. But this hardware encryption isn't really meant to provide security for the contents of the data in a live environment. It's actually implemented more as a faster, secure wipe. What the iPhone can do is, given a password, encrypt the file system with that password. And then in the event of receiving a remote wipe signal, instead of going through the tedious process of trying to overwrite the entire disk, it simply overwrites the key. So all of the data is still there, it's just encrypted, but technically you don't have the key, so it's secure. Which is to say that you shouldn't trust the hardware encryption for your own application's encryption needs. Make sure that if you have any encryption needs, you're handling those appropriately yourself. So wrapping things up here, on Measure, all of the platforms have their own pros and their own cons. How those pros and cons measure up depend entirely on the background that you're coming from. It's going to be up to you to decide which ones are acceptable, which ones are unacceptable, which ones you can mitigate, which ones there's just no working around given what your application needs to do. It's your own strengths in programming that are going to help your applications more secure, not the platforms themselves. The platforms can only help make things better. They help you be the best programmer you can be. But all in all, there's no going to be perfect security in your applications, but there's going to be just right, depending on your measurements. So I'm not sure how we are on time because the stopwatch never started, but we have plenty of time for Q&A if folks. Oh, 20. Okay. Well, let's see. Questions? I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Yes. Oh, okay, sure. So yeah, just a couple of days ago, the Citibank iPhone application was removed from the store because it turns out that they had been hiding user credentials and bank transaction data on the file system. I'm not sure how that came to their attention, but it's certainly, I believe, a PCI violation, which is why they got so concerned about it. Even if they had been storing it in encrypted fashion, they could have been in trouble there. Certainly the safest thing to do given their environment is if they had saved the credentials in the keychain and on a per instance loading of the application just receive state from the server, then they wouldn't have to worry about saving that information. But it seems they did anyways, and they've learned the hard way that they need to go back and rewrite things. Yep. Sure. Okay, gotcha. So I was just someone who's making sure I clarify that when you're calling auto release on something in the main thread, that it automatically gets released. What were you saying there? For every iteration of the run. Okay, cool. All right. Well, I'm sorry that I finished a lot sooner than expected. I've given talks before where I've gone over, and so maybe I compensated in the wrong direction this time. We've finished with the Q&A here, but I have a question of my own for someone in the audience. This is my girlfriend, Alexandra. She's had the bad luck of having been born so close to DEF CON, but I've had the good luck of her accepting my date request over 12 years ago. So I have a question for her if she would come up stage. Alex? Would you marry me?
I will.
All right.